we do have an official debate happening. We have Goodfather, we have Dan. For this debate, Goodfather's taken the position that the minimum wage is hurting America and we should get rid of it. Dan has taken the opposition. Winner will be based upon who concedes. We don't get a vocal concession from either participant. We'll put it to a voting poll in which you, the audience, can decide on who you think performed better overall in the debate. No moderation, no time limit. Thank you both for debating. You can get started. Did you want to open up, Goodfather?
No, I thought we agreed Dan would.
Okay, I think I misheard you. All right, okay, so I will go ahead. So hi, I'm Dan, and I am here with my new friend, Goodfather, perhaps the Goodfather, and we are going to debate minimum wage. Now, what's great is, I think, Goodfather, you said a couple minutes ago in the chat that your argument is basically that minimum wage hurts America and it should be abolished. And it's really easy for people to sneak in premises and stuff like that when they frame their opponent's argument, their interlocutor's argument. So can you confirm that I'm picking up what you're putting down?
Yeah, basically.
Okay, cool. All right, so I can sympathize, perhaps even empathize with this viewpoint. When I was younger, I actually explored this viewpoint. Now, I'm not going to say I committed to it, but I was definitely pretty curious about it and was surprised by how much sense it makes to remove minimum wage. Now, I'm not going to get super mathy about it just to save time, but here I'll post a link to a Khan Academy video in the chat that kind of explains why in a perfect market, creating a minimum wage ends up reducing total surplus, total value for the society as a whole. Now, what do we mean by perfect market? I think the easiest analogy is like in a physics 101 class. If you're going to study the trajectory of a projectile, I throw a ball, we ignore air resistance. Why? Because let's find out the base behavior and then we can add nuances as we do. And oftentimes it's very difficult to do that. Perhaps even more so in economics. So in what I'm going to call, the perfect model, zero air resistance, basically you can just imagine supply and demand. If I increase the cost of a job from $6 an hour to $7 an hour, then there will be less jobs available in a perfect market. We can imagine I increase the price of an apple by $1, people buy less apples. Make sense? People buy less jobs, in a way. So it makes sense. It totally makes sense in a perfect market. Because the amount of jobs that you lose multiplied by the amount of more dollars that the people with the jobs are making and the people supplying the jobs are getting out of that labor is less than what it used to be. So society as a whole gets less value in that perfect model. However, what I'm going to argue is that since we're not in a perfect model when we take it to society, that this doesn't necessarily hold up. And I'm going to argue that in the long run, impositions on labor control, and I don't mean total imposition, but safeguards like this against labor control by firms ends up forcing firms to innovate the actual technology of creation itself, just creation of whatever product, intellectual, tangible, etc. And that ends up benefiting society in the long run far more than what you end up losing in terms of creating a minimum wage in the immediate timeline. And I think I'm probably hitting my time, or at least what would be a reasonable amount of time. So I will end my opener at that.
Now, I see what you're arguing, and I definitely will agree with the supply and demand that if you increase the price or decrease the price of labor, it will lead to a decrease or increase in the amount of jobs. And what I'm trying to argue is that when you have a minimum wage, that makes it harder for unskilled workers to get a first job. And basically, I think that it will hurt the economy. And I think the narrative is that most people working at minimum wage jobs are working for corporations who are exploiting them, when in reality most jobs come from small business who have a hard time dealing with an increase in the cost of labor. And I think ultimately it hurts the economy. And I think this is most apparent in Puerto Rico, where they have 30% unemployment, because basically what happened was that the federal government implemented a minimum wage, so nobody could actually afford to hire people. So now everyone is just basically jobless. And as I said, I think it was 30% joblessness, unemployment, sorry, in Puerto Rico. And I think it's also apparent in states with high minimum wages, such as Seattle. What you saw was that when they implemented the $15 minimum wage, you had a loss in jobs. A lot of employees were laid off in different small businesses. I mean, corporations are those who can easily manage an increase in the minimum wage because they actually have high profit margins, so they won't feel it as badly as small business who are constantly struggling. And that is basically my proposition. I don't know if you have anything to say in response.
No, I think it's a pretty good opener. I get the jive, right? We have an example. We have Puerto Rico, where they implemented a minimum wage, increased unemployment, which kind of goes to what I was saying earlier with in perfect market conditions. And I don't mean perfect for the people. I just mean, ideal for the people trying to calculate what would happen. You increase the price, you lower the quantity. So increase of minimum wage implies less jobs for people, right? Is that kind of what you're saying? And you're giving
Yeah,
Puerto
I
Rico as an
mean,
example?
you can sum it up in that way, I guess.
Okay, sounds good. I like that you're including Puerto Rico as a state, because I like to tell people, when Puerto Rico is about to become a state, invest in flag making companies, because every government building is going to need a new flag because we'll have 51 stars. Uh, little inside scoop. Anyways, so we have an example, but I don't know if one example is going to do it for us, especially because we're talking about an
Now, I
island.
could provide multiple examples if that's your problem with this whole argument. I mean, you saw back in, I think it was the 70s. I don't know if I'm correct, but then you had teenagers working their first jobs at a gas station where they would like fill up cars with gas. And the only reason it was profitable for a gas station was because they didn't have to pay their employees that much. But when the minimum wage was eventually increased, they had to lay off all their employees because it didn't make sense anymore. So, I mean, that's just another argument. And I think that when you decide a wage, it's entirely between the employee and the employer. But yeah, you can continue.
I'm glad that you bring up the teenager thing, because I think that it definitely does impact the young, what I'm going to call the pre-college. Acknowledging that not everybody goes to college, or pre-training, pre-specialty, whatever you want to call it. College is just the easiest example. I mean, you get a degree that says, "Hey, this is the thing that I try to specialize in." Suppose that Billy, I can pay $5 to bring you the paper, but now the minimum wage is 15. Well, suppose, Billy's a young person name, right? So uh, suppose that Billy is 15, but then Joey is 23 and he'll do it. Well, Joey's able to pedal faster, etc. So I may as well take Joey over Billy. However, because otherwise Joey was costing more money, he was costing $10 an hour, but since now they're both more expensive, blah, 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 blah. So I think that totally makes sense. However, now Billy doesn't have a job. What is Billy going to do? Well, there's a few things. Billy can try to find a better job, or Billy can try to enter training. He can try to enter education, which ideally is in itself largely training. He can do a lot of things that end up making him a skilled worker as opposed to an unskilled worker. And that's one of the long-term innovation impositions. I like that because it has alliteration. That I think a minimum wage can induce. The minimum wage hurts low-skilled laborers the most, right? Sometimes called unskilled, but that's not necessarily the nicest thing to call them. And what that's going to do, at least for them, is it's going to incentivize them to gain skills and specialties. Now, not everybody can afford that, right? Not everybody can afford to get themselves by while doing that. However, this is where we kind of leave our perfect air resistance hypothetical, right? Our ideal market. And we end up in a market that includes things like unemployment, welfare, etc. And, the entire intent of that is to help people while they're in between jobs. And so the existence of that bars the issue of, okay, well, now these people don't have jobs and they can't get training. So one thing that what you just said shows is that people are incentivized to become more skilled workers. And when you have more skilled workers in your society, it means that it costs less time by definition. It costs either less time or resources to produce a given good, right? Are you down with that definition of skilled?
Yeah, that you're capable of producing more goods and services, provide more services.
And okay, perfect. Yeah. So I think it's useful for society when more people are incentivized to become more specialized. And so we have an example here where that is the case. And as long as it is possible for people to do that, then, well, there we go. Right. And especially in, again, our real world scenario, when you have things like Coursera, you have they're also often called moots, right? Massive online, I forget what the whole thing stands for, but the things like the MIT lectures and Coursera and all that jazz. And so now we have not just government, what I'm going to call safety nets, especially since we're talking about America. So it's nice that I can scope it in on that allow us to say that the people who are not skilled aren't totally thrown away. They now have time to gain training, and now they have incentive to gain training.
So, I would like to focus on that when Democrats are talking about the minimum wage, they often have the narrative that, oh, if we have a minimum wage and say let's say restaurants, that doesn't decrease the amount of people who go eating in restaurants. It increases it because now the people working in the restaurants can actually afford it. But that doesn't matter because the people who are working in the restaurants are either fired or have their hours cut. So, you haven't really argued that, but I just thought I'd point it out. And another thing about the minimum wage is that when an employer has to hire somebody, if there is a minimum wage, that employer would rather hire somebody who's skilled, because when he's hiring someone, that employer takes a chance. Can this worker actually produce something for me? Can this worker provide value for my business? So you're more inclined to hire a non-skilled worker, say as a waitress, than you are if you have a high minimum wage. Well, let's say that you would rather not take the chance and hire somebody who's actually worked in restaurants before as a waitress, or have been Yeah, I think there's an education for becoming a waitress, at least in my country. But I just thought I would point that out.
That's a really good point. And when you started saying that, I realized that I had actually not addressed the argument that you brought up about when you were talking about the gas station pumpers, um, the actual removal of that job itself, right? So that's a really good point. So I put it down on my little sticky note. That way I don't forget it. So we definitely have examples where those kind of jobs are removed. I believe in New Jersey, it is still a law that you cannot pump your own gas. I'm not sure why it's still. Maybe there's a. I actually don't know why that is the law in New Jersey, or maybe just because people in New Jersey just don't feel like getting out of their cars. Who knows? No offense to people from New Jersey, but what ends up happening is, and COVID's actually a really interesting example when it comes to the restaurant biz. But time will tell for that. So that's just a passing thought. We'll see. We'll see what happens. But what you're basically saying is that there's a selection to remove the jobs that were actually non-necessary. You get a removal, we have this term essential workers, which is, I'm not going to, it's not necessarily polarized, but it's lost a lot of meaning, I think. But what that does is it kind of, separates the wheat from the chaff. And I don't mean the people, I mean the jobs themselves. Like, do we really need these jobs? And, I worked in bars and restaurants for, God, 7 years? And I saw so many people who some even got their degrees and they just stayed in the biz because the environment that they were in did not incentivize them enough to kind of bite the bullet and grow and take more risks. There's this guy who, gave me 4 or 5 different Nietzsche books. He was 5 years older than me and he was still working bar. He had a degree. Why was he still there? So when you remove these jobs, you incentivize people to have to do jobs that are more essential, right? And so when you incentivize people to need those jobs, you also incentivize people to create those jobs. Once you see that there's a demand for labor, it also shows that there is potential to use that labor, right? If not also just creating an almost like a social brainstorming session. Okay, well, we could do this, we could do that, because now we don't need gas pumpers, we don't need as many waiters and waitresses. Why do we even have hostesses? Blah blah blah. And hosts, mind you, my brother's first job was a host. And so it's kind of stripping society of things it doesn't need. And when that happens, by definition, a higher percentage of jobs are now more efficient. They contribute more to society when you start cutting off what's not necessary. So I think that actually ends up, and this is, a good example of kind of what I mean by in the immediate, a single slice of time, I can see the downsides. But the long term, it ends up being useful. Society now has incentive for more important jobs, more important industries.
Now, I don't really think I agree with your point, because if a business can actually save money by having non-skilled workers instead of having people do it themselves, or there are other examples else than the one with the gas pumpers. But if a company can save money by hiring unskilled workers instead of having to invent new technology, which might be more expensive, might be cheaper, as we are seeing in the world today, that the companies are firing people in favor for superior technology, robots. But if a company can save money on this, why isn't this good for society? Because the workers benefit because they are paid to do this job, and the companies benefit because they can pay their shareholders more in dividends. They can earn more profits, expand their businesses. And another thing I'm not sure I've covered is that when you start working at a young age, you work up your skills. You start by being an unskilled worker, then you learn trades, then you are capable of producing more value for a company. You can provide services for people. So I mean, that's hard with a minimum wage because again, businesses don't have a reason to hire unskilled workers if they can just if they are taking such a big chance with it and they can just hire skilled workers because they can't now afford to have hire that many people anyway, and they have to cut back on hours and they have to increase prices.
I think that makes sense, and I think that actually goes to my point
But if you
of
think that makes
selecting
sense,
for.
are you then conceding to my point?
No, let me rephrase. I think that makes sense within the scope that it's looking at. Um, but I don't think it's necessarily the whole story. Like if we take those variables exclusively into account, I think it makes sense. If we take into account more context, I think it goes to my point that it incentivizes people to become trained. If the untrained, unskilled laborers can no longer compete with the trained, well, now they have to become trained. Um,
But how can they become trained if they don't have a job? I
so
mean,
that's
the
what I'm
way it
getting at.
usually works is that you get a job where you do something like I've delivered newspapers. A lot of people can do that. That's an unskilled job, and then I can work my way up and work up my trades and then become more valuable for businesses. I
I think.
mean, you
Go
say
ahead.
that it gives people uh, a reason to work up their trades, but that's what they're doing when they are getting their first job.
I think that perhaps in the past, gaining skills via actually working a job when it's a um, minimum wage job may have been more relevant. Um, but I don't know if it is because, for example, the newspaper boy, there's kind of a cap on how useful I can be to I can maximize how good I am of a newspaper boy, but the actual effect that that has on society is not very large. The effect that that has on the job itself, like I can be the best grocer in Food
No,
Line.
no,
Be the
I'm
most
not saying that
efficient.
you become like the best newspaper boy in town. I'm saying that you uh, start with a bad job that doesn't pay very much. Then you can try and search for a new job. Say that you have past job experience. I mean, that's what I have done, obviously, and then try and basically work your way up the ladder. I mean, I've actually heard the argument a lot that you can't live on the minimum wage, and you're not supposed to live on the minimum wage when you're 50 years old. I mean, it's not society's fault if you've been working the same 50-hour job at Walmart for the last 20 years and haven't tried to get a new job or work up the ladder in that same company, like try to get promoted to manager or assistant manager. So I mean, I just want to elaborate on it.
I mean, in a way, that shows that it selects for the people who are less innovative because the people who are less innovative are going to stay at that position. Now, when we're talking about gaining skills from simply working, and just, I'm a good newspaper boy, so now I can throw that on my resume, which makes it more likely for me to be hired for my next job, etc. There's a cap there. And then if we're talking about skills, we've now moved away from unskilled labor to skilled labor. But the question there is the refinement of the skills and whether those skills are still applicable without training. I mean, even in the past, if I was going, we had guilds, we had apprenticeships, stuff like that. If I wasn't going to be a farmer, hell, even when I was a farmer, where I was being trained to specialize in a craft. Because if I'm going to do something that requires a certain amount of expertise, that means that by definition, the first time I do it, it's not going to be very good. The second time I do it, it's not going to be very good. So I need a period of time where somebody is willing to pay for me or at least give me the time to gain those skills before I can actually utilize them. So I don't know if it's if we
Yeah,
can
but
say
in the
that
time that
earlier
you're
job
working
experience
up, in
helps.
the time you're working up your skills, your employer might not want to pay you the minimum wage because you're not producing that amount of value to him when you don't really know what you're doing. And that's one of the reasons that I think the minimum wage is bad, because it makes it harder for people to work up their trades and uh, become a more skilled worker. And I think an interesting story that I'd like to tell is that there's a YouTuber called Graham Stephan. He started at a 9 to 5 job in this big corporation investment bank, and you were supposed to have a degree to get a job there, but he wrote in his application, and they surprisingly they accepted. Obviously, he wasn't going to do the things that the ones with degrees did, like trading, but he could. His boss told him you could start down in the bottom. When you learn the company better, you can work your way up. But that's harder to do if your employer is taking more risk when he gives you a job, because he has to pay you, say, $15 an hour, when he can just, say, hire somebody who does have a college degree to the same price. So yeah, again, just thought I would point that out.
I think that goes towards my argument that it incentivizes training. If I can't get a job compared to somebody who is trained for a minimum wage job, well, what am I incentivized to do? I'm incentivized to gain training and gain specialties.
But again, that's the hard thing to do. It's hard to get training when you have a minimum wage, because then your employer has to take more risk when he employs you. I mean, it might take, say, 6 months for you to be as good at what you do as one of your coworkers who is a skilled worker. In that time frame, your employer takes a risk because he's paying you with the expectation that he's going to get value out of you in the future. But your employer is more hesitant when to do that when he knows that he has to pay you, again, say $15 or $10 an hour. Again, the minimum wage is different depending on the state.
I mean, I might argue if I am the employer and I'm taking more risk on somebody, once I already have somebody, that means that I would be taking more risk to swap them out for somebody else. I have a known versus an unknown, right? Which actually incentivizes me to keep that person and train them.
Sorry, could you just repeat?
If it is risky for me to hire somebody new and I already have somebody and I know what they're like, it incentivizes me, all else equal, to hold on to them and do what I can to maximize their skills for the job that they're performing. So the more risky it is to hire someone that I don't know yet, the more incentivization I have to keep the employees I have.
Yeah, I mean, of course, if you have very skilled employees who are actually doing a good job and providing a lot of value to your company, you would like to keep them as long as you're running a profitable business. But I don't know if it's just me, but I don't see what that has to do with the minimum wage. Because an employer would always like to keep his employees if they are valuable to him, if they're an asset to him or her.
For sure. Uh, that would always be a factor, but you said before that minimum wage increases the risk that an employer takes when they hire somebody. So if we say that the risk of hiring a new person goes up, that implies that the incentive to keep somebody also increases. Now,
Okay, so the
I think we're getting a
incentive
little
to
bit
people
pigeonholed.
increases, and then what?
Say that again?
The incentive to keep people increases, and what does that have to do in relation to? I mean, I don't really see where you're going, because of course, employer would like to keep his skilled workers when it's hard to get new workers, but I think an employer would always like to do that.
But if incentive increases, the I guess if incentive to keep increases incentive to train, then you end up with more incentive to train the existing workers you have, because we assume that there's always a bigger fish. You could hire somebody better, but you don't necessarily know that. So if you can just give the skills to the people that you have, because earlier this relates, because earlier you were saying that the person who hires them is taking a risk to train them. But once they have the person, it's in their interest to train them. But I think we're getting a little bit too micro. And if we're talking about for society, I want to make it a little. I think there's too many assumptions for this hypothetical. I think that it's useful to address something that you said earlier. And what you said earlier is the incentive for technology. And that's kind of the crux of my argument.
Hello?
So the incentive to become trained and stuff like that, that's useful. But the real crux of my argument of what helps society the most as a whole, and I guess that would contribute towards that, is society benefits when we create more product for less resources. That keeps more resources around that could be used for other things. The earth has more potentiality, because entropy increases whenever you make something. You also just can supply people with more for less, and thus it takes less to get more, right? In terms of how much I'm going to pay. So if I'm a business and I need to increase profits, right? What can I do? I can increase the price. I can decrease the cost, right? That's how it works. Now with the speed of communication, the amount of price matching that goes on is going to be hard to compete with, except for very, very local things. But even with that, it still applies, because I can only increase the price so much. And once I get to that, and unless we have a monopoly, in which case we're talking a whole different ballgame. So we're gonna assume the normal thing. So what I can do is I can reduce costs by resources and labor, right? That's what it costs for a product, regardless of if it's intellectual, if it's something like software, or something like a movie, or something like rubber ducks, or food, etc. It costs resources and labor. If I get to a point where I cannot just reduce my labor cost by decreasing wages, it incentivizes me to produce the product more efficiently, which is a net gain in the long run, because the other option of just decreasing wages, that's just a temporary measure, that's a temporary necessity. If you can't do that, even if you're laying off people, it means that the people that you're laying off, you must be restructuring in order to continue being able to produce with less people. And when you do that, you end up, again, society's creating more with less people, with less resources. But really, the main thing that it does is it incentivizes companies to figure out how to, for example, produce a rubber duck using less rubber, right? And every single time that happens, society benefits because there's more resources to go around. The only way that I can, not counting increasing prices, the only way that I can reduce costs on my end as a business, we're not going to count, bribery and shit like that. This isn't Rodney Dangerfield, right? If the only other way is to reduce cost per item. And kind of the real crux of what I'm saying is when that happens, in the long run, society is most benefited. Do you disagree with that?
I just want to say real quick, he might be having connection issues because he dipped out for a second.
Okay.
Can you hear us, Goodfather?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
I can hear you.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm having some connection problems. I think we left up. You were saying something that it would give companies incentives to develop new technology to make their business more efficient. Is that correct?
Either new technologies or even new processes. Imagine I have a warehouse and the item that I am selling the most happens to be at the back of the warehouse. And, and even micro things like this really can scale up. In fact, this is actually where my actual job deals with this sort of thing. Forget like labor costs, and let's just do something easy like gasoline. So suppose I have a forklift and it costs it costs gas for it to move, and suppose I have the most sold item in the back of my warehouse. I need to use more gasoline to move my product per day than if I put that at the front of the warehouse, right? So even things that aren't even just necessarily technological innovations, but just structural innovations that maybe just, like, is it really worth like doing that for the gas if I don't have these kind of constraints? The more that we create these constraints, the more that we create incentive for just general efficiency, both in structure, technology,
Now,
etc.
if I may interrupt, so what you're trying to say is that this is giving companies incentive to make their process more efficient and develop new technologies that can maybe make them earn more money. Correct?
Yes. I guess the thesis would be it incentivizes company to lower costs by, instead of cutting wages, it lowers costs by creating more product for less from less resources.
Now, I think companies are always incentivized to make new technologies, to make their production more efficient, to make their services more efficient, so that they can earn more profit, so that they in turn can pay their shareholders more dividends. So it's a more attractive investment and makes their company more valuable. So I don't see what that argument has to do with this whole deal, or how this makes them even more inclined, or even more even more want to efficientize and to make their services better.
I mean, that's kind of what I'm saying is it creates more incentive, right? Kind of like what you said. Like there already
Yeah,
is
but
incentive, but
I
when I put a
don't believe
restraint,
it
it
creates
enforces
more
that.
incentive than there already is. And that's just my opinion.
If I need 2,000 calories a day, and I can either eat apples or pears, suppose I have a little bit of both, but now all of a sudden I can't. Suppose I'm limited. I can only cut down to 5 apples a day. Let's say apples have 500 calories. Now I have to focus more on pears, which have more micronutrients, right? So, regardless of whether I was already eating pears, there is now a restriction that incentivizes me to go the more efficient route. And every time I do something more efficient, by definition, we get exponential gains with that. You only have linear gains or even really just temporary gains by decreasing wages, because you're not actually increasing possible future states. You're not increasing the ability to produce more product, because every time you create more efficiency, you put yourself in a position with more luxury to create more efficiency, right? Kind of like exponential versus linear.
Now, I think it's a valid argument, but I think we have covered most topics and it's getting late for me, so I don't think you're going to concede. I'm not going to concede, but if possible, I'd like to end the debate here.
Okay, sounds good. I propose that we both sum up what we think the other person is saying, and then we can agree or disagree on that. That way, we just make sure that we're on the same page.
So I think you're saying that this creates more incentive for companies to make their business model more efficient, or the services they provide more efficient, correct? and that in the bigger picture, that a minimum wage actually increases value, correct?
I would add to that that the potential downsides of less jobs to go around are mitigated by the structures that we have in place in America that allow somebody to have time where they don't have a job to gain skills. So that counters the issue of people hitting temporary unemployment because they're unskilled. So that's me addressing downside. And then me addressing upside is, well, I guess the other, well, actually, no. So me addressing upside is it selects for jobs that were not necessary to be removed, which increases more incentive for new necessary jobs. It increases incentive for companies to increase the efficiency of their process, which is what you addressed. So I would the answer is yes, and also the stuff that I added at the beginning.
Okay, and did you want to sum up my point as you see it?
For sure. So from what I take it is your point is that my points about increase of efficiency are already present. That there is already pressure for an increase of efficiency. And you don't seem to think that a minimum bar on how much I can cut from my labor creates a noticeable, or at least like significantly impactful or maybe worthwhile cost of that added incentive to create efficiency. You also seem to be saying that a downside of minimum wage is the loss of these jobs, and you are taking as a premise that continuing to work a particular job increases your general skills, not even necessarily for that job, but just for having jobs in general.
Yeah, I would like to elaborate. It makes it easier for you if it's easy to get your first job, to work to develop your traits and become more valuable for business, and that yeah, that the minimum wage overall just hurts job growth. And yeah, I think you covered it pretty well. Well, I'd like to say thanks. I think you did good in this debate.
Okay, awesome. I mean, there's a couple like other nuances that I wouldn't mind getting to, but I understand that you're in a different time zone. It's a lot later for you than it is for me. So I think, yeah, I think I'm in a pretty good spot to for us to be like, okay, yeah, like what do people think? And yeah, likewise. This is my first debate, and this was pretty cool. And you're pretty nice. You're pretty nice, and I like that. So thank
Yeah,
you.
I
And
mean,
you brought up some cool
you're a
points.
nice guy too, and I think I covered all of my points. I also think you covered most of your points. And and this is my second debate, so I was a bit nervous in the beginning, but you were very respectful, so I'd like to say thanks.
Okay, awesome. They're telling us the kiss in the chat, or at least Gil. But